excited to kick this off and turn this over to ERIKA Henderson, who's the program associate with Memphis. We have both ERIKA Henderson and our VIP guest today, Sonia Nazario. Their bios are in the platform as well, which you can read this. But I want to just take a moment just to say thank you. Share My Lesson benefits from over 300 different partners, and Facing History is really an exceptional partners of ours. We have done so much fun, incredible work together, including this webinar and bringing some really, really rich content online through these webinars and other resources that they create. They're incredible, and they've got incredible resources. And if you haven't been using their resources, I'm sure you will tonight. And tonight's conversation with Sonia Nazario on exploring immigration is such an important topic. It's such an important time to be having this conversation. Sonia, we're so grateful to have you here today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn myself off and turn this over to these incredibly amazing women and have you guys take it from there. So over to you, ERIKA. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, and good evening, everyone. So I'm excited to talk to you about our agenda for the evening. We won't be with you long, but it's power-packed. We're going to tell you a little bit more about ourselves shortly, and then I'll tell you a little bit about facing history in ourselves. We believe a lot in identity. We believe that who you are is important, and how you interact with others is shaped by who you are. So we'll be talking about who Facing History is, and then we'll have a conversation with Ms. Sonia Nazario. I'm totally excited. I'm coming from an educator standpoint myself, and so I think that you're going to really enjoy hearing more about this book and even more about the topic. Then we'll have some classroom connections on how you can specifically use some resources in the classroom, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and answers from you all as audience members. So without further ado, our VIP guest this evening is Dr. Sonia Nazario. She's an award-winning journalist whose stories have tackled some of the country's most intractable problems: hunger, drug addiction, immigration, and she's won some of the most prestigious journalism and book awards, including 2 Pulitzer Prizes. She was a finalist for a 3rd Pulitzer Prize in public service. She is best known for ENRIQUE'S journey, her story of a Honduran boy's struggle to find his mother in the U.S., published as a series in the LA Times. ENRIQUE'S journey won the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing in 2003. And I am an educator by heart. I've been in education for over 20 years. I've served as a principal, an assistant principal, a literacy coach, and now a program associate, an associate program director for Facing History ourselves. My background is English. So for those of you who are also English lovers as myself, I have some treats for you tonight. I am a graduate of Union University in Memphis, Tennessee, and of Lamont College as well, as National Louis University in Chicago. So we have a question for you. You've heard the title, Facing History in Ourselves. Our next poll question is for you to tell us, how familiar are you with Facing History in Ourselves? So you can take this moment to click in the box and answer this poll question. And as you're answering, some of you as you're answering that, you might want to show how you're using Facing History or how you've used it in the past in the chat box, in the group chat. The choices: I'm brand new to Facing History. What is a Facing History? I've used some of your resources, or I'm a seasoned. We call you a Facing History fan, like myself. I started off as a Facing History fan until I finally was able to work with the organization, and it's been incredible. So we want you to check one of those 3 boxes and let us know how familiar you are. And I'm also monitoring some of the subjects that you teach. Some of you, oh, someone's at a Facing History school. Some of you teach Spanish and English. Awesome. You have a middle school unit on the Holocaust. Absolutely. We have an awesome exploratory 7th grade semester-long course that actually offers basic history as well at the 7th grade level and at our high school level. Some are ESL and history. And you've seen our Reconstruction unit. Awesome. And then there are a few that are brand new to Facing History. That's awesome. Well, that's great. Well, let me introduce you tonight. So here are some of our results. We have a lot who are brand new to Facing History, and then a few who are seasoned. So welcome all seasoned folks and folks who are new to Facing History. Here's a little bit about us. What we do is combine the rigorous content of an interactive pedagogy to help students get the opportunity to look at tough questions, ethical dilemmas, and historical moments to help them think critically about how to make connections to today and to their lives. We believe that people make choices and choices make history. Our mission is to use lessons of history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to bigotry and hatred. That's our mission. And the ultimate goal is not just to help students learn content, but to increase their agency. We believe that informed civic agency is their student power and student voice. This empowers them to be active students and active citizens. It develops their sense of empathy and, of course, their critical thinking skills. I've met students that come from Facing History classes in person, one-on-one. I've known them over the time that I've worked with Facing History. And what happens in a Facing History course is transformational, not just for students, but also for teachers. Here are a few of our resources. Some of you in the chat box did bring some of those up. You're familiar with the Reconstruction era. It's one of the undertaught subjects of American history, and we have a really robust teaching unit on Reconstruction era and the fragility of democracy. The next cover that you see is from Holocaust and Human Behavior. We look at the atrocity of the Holocaust, but we also look at the choices that individuals made. We look at the small steps that occurred that led to the Holocaust and even the legacies of the Holocaust and what happened afterward. One particular story that's true that I found to be really incredible is the story of Elie Wiesel's Night. And so we have an awesome teaching guide on Night, as well as To Kill a Mockingbird. So between these that you see on the screen, I would say that Night and To Kill a Mockingbird are two of my most reached resources that I use on a pretty regular basis. A lot of people look at To Kill a Mockingbird as the story of growing up for Scout, but actually you even get a chance to see the story behind Tom Robinson. And Atticus Finch says that you walk a mile in another person's shoes to find more about them. My part of the story is also in our exploratory course, and that's for many of our middle school students, but sometimes high school students use it as well. Again, we talk a lot about identity. We talk about one's place in our country and how do students fit in and how does your identity, the complexity of identity plays a part, even with names and with where people are from. And then the last part is that Eyes on the Prize is one of the units that Facing History partnered with PBS. And you've heard of the Eyes on the Prize series. We actually have teaching units to go along with the Eyes on the Prize series. So these are just a few. One of the reasons why I fell in love with Facing History was with all of the resources. As a former ELA teacher, I found that was really one of the prizes. And as a part of the Facing History Network, you actually get access to all of these resources, including online handouts that you can download, the PDF of the entire teaching unit that you see, as well as DVDs and even books you can check out. So our approach is this. We have what's called the journey, and this scope and sequence includes starting with the individual. We talk about membership with we and they. We talk about a case study, and in some cases, it's a historical case study. In the case of ENRIQUE'S journey, we use literature, which is also still historical because it is a true story, to teach lessons about history. And then we look at legacy and memory, and how do we choose to remember things? And then now that we know all of this, what do we do about it? So that's the choosing to participate. On the right, you see our pedagogical triangle, which we call our mojo. This is how we do what we do. We believe that students need a balanced way of engagement, and that engagement comes through intellectual rigor, asking tough questions or ethical reflection, and of course, emotional engagement. And they all lead to that civic, informed civic responsibility or that student agency. And so I know that that is a lot, but is absolutely accessible later after this call and this webinar. You'll be able to come back to that. But I'm just excited to get to talk to Ms. Sonia Nazario. So Sonia, I just wanted to see if you wanted to greet everyone, and then I'll start with a few questions.
Hi, Kelly. Hi, ERIKA. I am thrilled to be here. I'm a little intimidated. My first language in the home was Spanish, to be in front of a bunch of teachers, but here we go. And I'm a huge fan of Facing History and ourselves. I've done a lot of work with Facing History around the country, so I'm thrilled to be here.
Awesome. We're excited to have you. And I'm going to start with the first question from one of my colleagues who was also with Facing History. He's a friend and a colleague, Mr. Adam Strom. He has now an organization called Reimagining Migration. And he calls migration our shared experience as humans. Sonia, I believe your work shows both the power of our shared experiences and how stories make change happen. What drew you as a journalist to telling stories about migrants?
Well, I've written about all sorts of social issues and social justice issues, but it's my identity, as you talked about before. My family has 100 years of fleeing persecution. The first photo here is of my father's family, who fled Christian persecution in Syria in the 1920s to go to Argentina. The second photo is of my mother's Jewish family. They fled Poland before World War II when my mother was a young girl, and her relatives who didn't flee were gassed in Auschwitz. And then my family came to the US as the military in Argentina increasingly controlled the universities. My father was a professor, so he came to the US. This is the last photos of the first day where he arrived to the United States. And I'm the only one in my family born in the United States. I always felt growing up like I had one foot in both worlds. And I myself fled persecution. When my father died, my mother took us back to live in Argentina as the military was gaining power and would kill 30,000 people over the coming few years. So we fled to return back to the United States. So I understand that sense of persecution quite personally. So I think it's a part of me writing about migration, writing about immigrants, and really understanding that the difficulties that people have in leaving their homelands, and the drive that they have once they're here to make it. They've given up everything, their families, their language, to come to a new land and start all over again. So I understand that drive that so many migrants have as well. I just saw a study that half of the Fortune 500 companies are founded by migrants. So, so there's a lot of why I personally write about this, but I think it's an important issue to address also. As the number of migrants grew from 1990 to 2010, we had 27 million people that came here legally and not. And that was numerically more than at any time in our nation's history. And so increasingly, they didn't just go to the 6 traditional states like California, Texas, New York. They went everywhere in the United States. These were people's new neighbors across this country. And I thought it was important for people to understand who their new neighbors are. For 1 in 4 Americans, immigration is their biggest issue. And it's an increasingly polarizing issue with so many misconceptions. I think it's used as a wedge issue by both sides of the political aisle to motivate, to rile up their bases. And so I think an issue with so many misconceptions needs a lot more light.
That's good. So you've actually even gone into some of the next question I was going to ask about why this is such an important issue. Can you talk about this article, how everything began in your research with ENRIQUE'S journey?
Well, I've continued, I reported ENRIQUE'S journey in 2000 and 2003. The story of this mother who came from Honduras and left her children behind, and then the incredible journey that her son makes to come and find his mother after not seeing her for 12 years. But this is a story that continues, and there's been a huge shift in who is coming to this country and why they're coming to this country and how we are treating them once they arrive to this country. And so I went back to ENRIQUE'S neighborhood in 2014 to report that story that you were just showing, the red cover, the children of the drug wars. It was on the cover of the opinion section of the New York Times. But traditionally, it was single Mexican men who came to the United States. But now there's been a real shift in the last decade. It's mostly families and children from 3 countries in Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, that have become some of the most violent countries on this earth. And what we saw as a result of that violence in these countries was that in 2014, you just skip forward to the next slide, it shows this huge surge of unaccompanied immigrant children who were arriving at our border, our southern border, by themselves with no parent by their side. It jumped tenfold suddenly. And in fact, this year we'll have we just concluded the fiscal year, 73,000 of these children coming alone were apprehended on our southern border, the highest number ever recorded. And so in the past, we mostly had people coming for a better life. But now what we were seeing when I went back to ENRIQUE'S neighborhood were increasing control of these neighborhoods by gangs and by narco cartels. And the second image here shows that the United States spent about $8 billion in the past decade or two to try, in our war on drugs, to try to slow the flow of cocaine. It starts in Colombia and Latin America, the cocaine, and those red lines are drug flights. And they used to come to the Caribbean and those drugs would go on to the US. But as we squeeze those drug routes, the US, you and I as taxpayers, the narcos, the drug flights turned left and they started landing 4 out of 5 of those drug flights in Honduras. And Honduras, the country that ENRIQUE is from, the boy that I wrote about, developed the #1 homicide rate in the world of countries not at war. And so what we saw are these neighborhoods that are controlled by gangs, controlled by narco cartels, where boys as young as 10, 11 years old are forcibly conscripted to join the gangs. They're trying to control that turf to move those drugs north or sell those drugs in these neighborhoods. And increasingly girls are told, like the girls that I saw in ENRIQUE'S neighborhood, you're pretty, you're gonna be the girlfriend of the gang leader, and if you refuse, my gang will exterminate your whole family here in Honduras. So we saw a real shift in what was happening in these countries, and it was mostly the push factors, this fire in their country, this violence that was pushing these children and these migrants out. And that's what we're seeing at our southern border now.
So Sonia, looking at the numbers, even on these charts and even in the pictures, it could kind of take some of the human element out of it. What I really like about what you did with Enrique's journey was that you humanized this story into one that was universally relatable, right? So can you talk more about the precipice for the book concerning Enrique's story specifically?
Sure.
Like
So the story for me started with a conversation I had one morning in this house that I'm in right now in Los Angeles with the woman in the first image. Her name is Carmen, and she used to clean my house twice a month. And I thought she just had one young boy. And one morning I asked her, "Are you thinking about having any more children?" And she was normally chatty and happy, and she just went stone silent, and she started sobbing in my kitchen. And she told me about these 4 children that I knew nothing about, that she said she had left behind in Guatemala, where she was from, in Central America. She said, "Sonia, I'm a single mother. My husband left me for another woman. Most days I could only feed my kids once, maybe twice, but at night, my kids would cry out to me with hunger, and I had nothing left to give them." And she showed me that morning. I still remember how she would gently coax her kids to roll over in bed at night, and she would tell them, "Sleep face down so your stomach doesn't growl so much." She had left her kids in Guatemala, these 4 children, with their grandma, and she had come north to work in the US. And she told me she hadn't seen her children in 12 years. I mean, can you imagine that? Leaving your children, walking away, going 2,000 miles north, not knowing when or if you're going to see your children again. And it was really that desperation. And what I saw was that her story was not a single story. It was a story of millions of single moms. The face of who was coming to the US was changing already, and it has changed even more in the years since. It wasn't single men from Mexico. It was millions of single moms coming here, leaving children behind. And so I wanted to tell this story, and I found a family. I found a boy, Enrique. This is the photo of him, the second image. He is from Honduras, and when he's just 5 years old, this is his kindergarten snapshot, mugshot, shortly after his mother leaves him in Honduras, and she comes north. And after 12 years of not seeing his mother, she promised she would return quickly. She would send for him quickly, but life here in the US is a lot tougher than advertised, and these separations from moms stretch 5 or 10 years or even more. This is an incredibly common story in the United States. And so these children set off on their own on this journey across Mexico to come and find their mothers in the United States. And they often make this harrowing journey on gripping onto the tops and sides of freight trains to come and find their mothers. And so I found Enrique when he was already in northern Mexico. He was on his 8th attempt to get through Mexico. He had been deported 7 times by Mexico. And I spent 2 weeks with him there. He was on the muddy banks of the Rio Grande, just struggling to survive. And I wanted to show readers what he was going through. And then I went back to where he started the journey, and I did the same journey that he had just made, step by step, in the exact same way. So I started at his grandma's house in Honduras. I traveled 1,600 miles through Mexico on top of 7 freight trains. So it's a modern day odyssey that these children are going on. There are gangsters that control the tops of the trains, bandits alongside the rails, corrupt cops, a whole host of people trying to hunt them down, rob them, rape them, beat them, deport them. And there were 73,000 Enrique's caught at our southern border, children traveling alone, children as young as 7 years old, making this journey alone. It's incredible.
Wow. I mean, I think even the fact that you've made the journey also, I think that just really, it's such an incredible story to hear. And one thing that I think that a lot of readers say after they've read it is that it helps them to empathize more with migrants. It even helps them to see asylum seekers and refugees and immigrants in a different way. Was there a personal influence for you or a key moment that kind of shifted things either before you met Enrique that caused you to increase your, what we call your universe of obligation, or to kind of shift? We think of the universe of obligation as those who we take care of, those who we want to protect, those kind of things. Was there a key moment for you or a personal influence like that?
Well, I think certainly the woman who cleaned my home and seeing what she was going through. And I think many people have this experience with people who clean their wastebaskets at night in their offices, or who clean their homes or take care of their children. Often these women are taking care of children and loving that boy that they take care of, but they're not there to see their own son take their first few steps or hear their daughter's first words. But I think for me also the empathy, my urgency to act, to not just write about these things, but to become an advocate and become an activist, which has been a difficult journey for me, also was sparked by seeing a 7-year-old boy in Los Angeles immigration court. When children come here, any immigrant comes to the United States, and you have to go to immigration court to prove that you should be entitled to stay here legally. You know, if you commit a crime in the United States and you can't afford a lawyer, a public defender is going to be assigned to you, but not if you're an immigrant, even a child. And so I watched the 7-year-old boy in immigration court shaking like a leaf, standing before that judge, being asked to present a complex legal asylum case. 2/3 of these children can't afford a lawyer. And so you know, there are 24 babies that went to immigration court last year with no lawyer by their side. And this just struck me as wrong. And I wanted to try to be more of an advocate for these children. I wanted to try to break down what I see as a very complex and very polarizing issue for readers, because I think that too often we get misinformation both from the left and the right on these issues. And often what I have said in my subsequent stories in the New York Times, where I'm a contributing opinion writer on these issues, have pissed off both the left and the right. I think it's really important today, when the nature of who's coming has changed so radically. Children who are fleeing for their lives. You know, after World War II, during World War II, the U.S. turned away a ship with 900 Jews on board, and we wouldn't let them dock at our shores. We wouldn't let Anne Frank's family come to this country when they applied in 1941. And when that ship was turned back, hundreds of those Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. And the U.S., Eleanor Roosevelt, became leaders after the war in the modern-day refugee movement, and saying, we will not turn people back to their deaths. And yet I feel this is what too often we are doing today with children and women who are running for their lives from these very conflicted countries that are our neighbors in Central America. So this is another reason why I think we need to expand our universe of obligation. You know, I'm not an open borders gal, but I believe that when it comes to refugees and people who are seeking asylum, we need to do our part if we're asking the rest of the world to do so as well.
That's really good. And so in the book, you talked about a village of people who took an upstanding role in a different kind of way. Could you talk about those people that helped in a way that wasn't necessarily kind of typical for the children who were going through those struggles of trying to escape?
I think that what I saw in Mexico on this journey, these kids go through horrible things. In the south of Mexico, many of them have been robbed, beaten. Something bad has happened to them in the first of 13 states that they're going to have to cross. But when they reach South Central Mexico, I saw something remarkable. And I saw a model of what Facing History talks about being upstanders, standing up for the right thing. And I saw upstanders that I think all of us can emulate, that when you see a human being in front of you that is in need, to try to live your life with an open heart, to try to act, to help that human being. And what I saw was that whenever there was a curve in the tracks, or for some reason this train had to slow down, 30, 40 people would rush out of these humble huts with these bundles of food in their arms, and they'd start waving and smiling and shouting out to the migrants on top of the train. They threw bread, tortillas, whatever fruit was in season. When I was on top of the train, there were these huge branches of bananas that were landing on top of my head. If they didn't have food, as you see in the second photograph, they gave tap water. And if they didn't have that, they'd line up next to the tracks. They would put their hands together in prayer, and they would pray for these migrants as they passed by. These are the poorest Mexicans along the tracks, but they were giving a little of what they had to strangers from other lands. And all of these people told me, you know what, Sonia, I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. It's the Christian thing to do. I may not have read the 92 references to the stranger in the Old Testament, but I know that this is what Jesus would do if he were standing in my shoes. And these people were a model for me in deciding to step forward and be less of an educator, less of a bystander, and more of an activist, of an advocate, of someone who stands up for people who are in need, like these migrants.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely inspiring. So then go ahead.
You know, I have to say I'm a big proponent for refugees and asylees, but I think it's really important when you're delving into these issues. When I go and speak at high schools and colleges around the country, and I speak in some of the most conservative parts of the United States, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are many sides to this issue, that there are winners and losers in terms of this wave of immigration that we've seen in recent decades. You know, that people who don't have high school degrees are being forced to compete in certain industries with the migrants who are coming here, that the migrants themselves lose out in a way, because if you leave your child for 10 years, they're going to resent and walk up to the line of hating you for doing that. They don't understand, why did my mother walk away and never come back? And so I think in my speaking to students or whoever it is, I first try to acknowledge, listen, I get it. We had almost 1 million people at our southern border this year. That's a lot of people. I understand that this isn't totally positive for everyone. And when you do that, I think that people who you are talking to about this issue are willing to hear the other side, which is the U.S. had no small role in the mayhem in these countries. We deported 300,000 criminals to Central America, and this fueled a lot of the violence. We sided with the right, with conservatives in the wars in Central America, where there was an effort to redistribute wealth. And our war on drugs has created mayhem in these places as the cartels fight for territory to bring these drugs north to us, the largest consumer of illegal drugs in the world. But I think it's important to acknowledge that this is not a cut and dry issue. It's an issue with many shades of gray. Can you still hear me? Hello?
Yep, I can hear you. ERIKA, did ERIKA drop off?
I think she did. Yeah, let me just say one last thing as she's coming back on.
And there are some questions too, so yeah, please keep going.
Okay. I mean, I think the other thing that I really emphasize on the immigration issue is that today we really have to deal with the root causes of what's pushing people out of these countries in terms of the violence, the corruption, very weak government institutions. Honduras is basically a narco state today, and there were things that the U.S. Was doing in terms of foreign aid aimed at trying to change those conditions in those countries, and unfortunately a lot of that foreign aid was completely cut off, and now a little bit of it has been restored in the last couple of days. But I went to Honduras, and I've reported on U.S. Violence prevention programs that were started in Los Angeles and in Boston. And I went to the most violent neighborhood in the murder capital of the world, San Pedro Sula, Honduras. And there the U.S. Funded outreach centers where kids could go in this neighborhood after school to get away from the gangs. and a program where you take kids with the risk factors of going into gangs and put them into family counseling, and it reduces 77% their odds of engaging in violence. And most importantly, the U.S. funded programs that went after the killers in this neighborhood. 96% of all homicides in Honduras get no conviction because witnesses won't come forward because they know that the gang will kill them tomorrow. So we funded a nonprofit that goes in and convinces witnesses over months to testify under a black burqa like they do in mafia trials in Italy. And by doing all this, we saw a 62% drop in homicides in the worst neighborhood in the murder capital of the world. And it cut the number of kids fleeing that neighborhood to the north, to us, in half. This works, and we should be doing more of this. It costs us $100 million to do this in Honduras versus billions of dollars once these children arrive at our border. It's more humane, and it actually works, as opposed to many of the things that we are doing in this country.
Thank you. That's incredible. I'm going to go ahead and we'll just keep going. I'm sure ERIKA will join on soon. But thank you for sharing that. I'm curious, what other transformative stories do you think would be more widely told and heard, or what do you think we need more at this moment?
Well, Facing History talks about how a single story told over and over again, the lie told over and over again, can become the dominant narrative. And so I think it's really important to show what is going on in these countries that is pushing. 6 in 10 people at our southern border are coming from these three very violent countries in Central America. And so this is what I try to do in these recent stories in the New York Times. I spent 5 weeks in ENRIQUE'S neighborhood earlier this year. I'm back in therapy because of that. I had a resurgence of my post-traumatic stress. But in the middle story, I'm writing about why so many women are fleeing these countries now. And I went to the 3rd largest city in Honduras, Choloma, and 4 in 10 women who are murdered, increasingly these women are being recruited by the narco cartels forcibly to sell drugs because they think that a man is more likely to buy drugs from a woman. And when they try to leave that, or they try to leave a gang boyfriend, they are murdered brutally. 4 in 10 are murdered in a way that goes far beyond what's necessary to actually kill them. And so women were telling me in this neighborhood that they strip women down like they're chickens. They take off their arms and legs, their breasts, their buttocks. Women were being skinned alive in the neighborhood I was in. And that's why I came back with this nightmare of being skinned alive every night. So trying to tell the stories, you know, our administration is telling people that they're faking it when they come to our southern border. Well, I can tell you in that neighborhood, I had someone murdered, shot in the head 1 block away from me. I was only there for 2.5 weeks. My taxi driver, 1 in 7 people in his group, was murdered while I was there. I can tell you that they're not faking it. The last story that I wrote about in the New York Times, these are on the cover of the Sunday opinion section, Pay or Die, is looking at the complexity of this problem in these countries that we have to help address. How extortion and corruption are driving people to leave because they give up on their countries. They give up that there will be any positive change in their countries. And 30 to 40% of the revenue of Honduras is going to corruption, into the politicians' pockets. Just to give you an example that might, hit home with the teachers here, there are 85,000 teachers in Honduras, but 30,000 of them are fake teachers. They are ghost teachers. They don't exist. They were given a paycheck because they had sex with the right person, or they paid a bribe, or their family was owed a political favor. In ENRIQUE'S neighborhood, there's not only fake teachers, there are whole ghost schools. And this debilitates these countries. And so that's why I believe the U.S. needs to help fight to reduce corruption and reduce violence in these countries. That is what will work versus building a wall. The Chinese built the mother of all walls, and it did not keep out the Mongols. But there are actual solutions, and that's what I want to really write about, in addition to humanizing why people are coming here.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think I know ERIKA might be on the phone right now, but I just want to say, if I didn't hate the idea of fake news and all the stuff that went around it, now I can understand I your PTSD. Wow, I feel like I'm having it just hearing your stories,
Right.
and this idea of fakeness is just incredible. I'm going to Erika. Are you there?
I am
Okay.
here. I apologize for that, not being able to have that internet. So I had one last question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So
Erika, really quickly before you go, start the question. I have just put up the next poll question. So while you're asking the question, you folks that are on, you can answer the question of do you teach about immigration in your classes? And there's several responses. All right, Erika.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So you may have already talked about this, Sonia, but are there other transformative stories that you think should be told more widely and heard? What do we really need at this moment?
Yeah, I was just talking about how I think we really need to understand what is happening in these neighborhoods. And as foreign staffs have been cut back at newspapers, we see less and less of this. So I think it's important to go in these neighborhoods and show that girl who's being forced to be the gang leader's girlfriend, show that 10-year-old boy who's being told you must work for the gang or we will kill your family. Show people what these folks are facing in their neighborhoods so that they understand that, as one expert said, when there's a fire in your house, you're going to try to get out of that house no matter how hard it is for you. And I think the whole policy in the U.S. has been one of deterrence. If you make things miserable enough for people, once they arrive at our southern border, they won't come. But that may work with someone who's an economic migrant, who's coming here for a better life. But if someone's trying to murder you in the next 24 hours, in ENRIQUE'S neighborhood, if you own a little business, a little store, the gang comes to you and says, you must pay the war tax every Monday or we will kill you. That person isn't worried about what's going to happen 2 months from now when they reach the U.S.-Mexico border. They're trying to get out of Dodge right now. So I think it's important to really understand the lives of these people in these neighborhoods and the changes that are needed. The U.S. has done a lot of negative things in these countries, but in recent years it was applying foreign aid to try to cut violence, to fund programs to try to cut violence and fund programs, these international groups that were going in and trying to reduce corruption in these places. And that's what's going to work ultimately. So I think it's really important to tell those stories and to keep the money going where it actually works. We need to really understand what's truly happening and what are the real solutions that will actually work.
And Erika, I don't know if you can see your screen, so I went ahead and just showed the results of do you teach immigration in your classes? So it's kind of a mix all over all three of the responses of a significant time, a short amount of time, or don't currently teach the immigration. I do want to do a quick 5 second just to mention about 10 more minutes and several questions coming in.
Yeah. I would urge more of you to teach about immigration. I know it's difficult to do these complex, polarizing issues, but if you don't, you leave a void that's filled by our increasingly polarized media landscape, whether it's MSNBC or Fox News, that both have a slant on this issue, that are not necessarily telling the truth on both sides about this issue. So I think with these polarizing issues, controversial issues, it's even more important to step in and try to tell as close to the truth as you can.
Absolutely. I totally agree that teaching it also helps students to be able to navigate multiple resources to kind of learn more about it by what they're seeing online and reading in the newspaper as well. So now, are there some questions that have come in, Kelly, as well, that you guys are?
Yeah, I'll go with the first one. I work in a county with a large migrant population. How do you teach the students about the immigration issues facing our country without appearing to favor one side of the argument or another?
Well, I go through kind of what we've been trying to do on this issue for the last 30, 40 years. I talk about we were spending $20 billion a year on border enforcement, and yet 97% of people who try repeatedly to get across that border are able to do so, the studies show. Most people who have become unlawful in this country in the last decade never came across the border. They came on an airplane with a visa and overstayed their visa, and the wall will do nothing to stop them. So I talk about border enforcement, guest worker programs, which have been the second thing that we keep trying. The big one was the Bracero program that ended in 1964. The problem is that you're supposed to be a guest worker for a time and then go home after a certain date, but more than half of the Braceros didn't go home, and that created the foundation of the wave of migration that followed from Mexico. And then I talk about the third thing, legalization, which would be great for people who are living in tremendous fear right now. I mean, these moms and dads are afraid to step out of their homes because they could be picked up and again separated from their children, their US-born children. But when we last did that in 1986, we went from 3 million people here unlawfully to 1 million people came out of the shadows legalized. But then they told friends and family down south, come on up. And they did. And we went from 3 million to 1 million to 11 million. I suck at math, but that didn't work as our politicians swore that this would end unlawful migration as we knew it. So I think from my perspective, you need to be honest that the approaches pushed by politicians both on the left and the right have not been successful if the goal is to slow the flow of migrants and keep more migrants at home, which is where, believe it or not, most of them would rather live. They'd rather be able to stay in their home countries and not fear for their lives and be able to feed their kids and send them to school past the 3rd grade, which is all my former house cleaner was able to do. And so I believe that we need to work on the root causes of the violence, work to help address some of these problems. And in the meantime, I believe in the tradition of our laws. We pass laws that say that if you come to our border and ask for asylum, we should allow you a process which lets you prove whether you deserve asylum in this country to stay here legally or not. And I believe that we should have compassion towards people who are running for their lives and reach our border instead of throwing them in these horrible prisons like the one 2 hours away from here in California, where there's maggots in the food and there's 3 people died in 3 months from lack of health care. We have people dying in immigration prisons, children who are dying. The feds went in and inspected this prison. They looked at 20 jail cells, and there were nooses hanging from 15 of them in this prison called Adelanto here in California. No one had even bothered to take these nooses down. I think instead of jailing people while their hearings are ongoing, slap an ankle monitor on them. The problem isn't that they don't show up to immigration court. They do show up to immigration court. 9 in 10 asylum seekers do show up to immigration court. I think more compassion on the front end, better due process. If you're a child, you shouldn't go to immigration court with no lawyer by your side. But, and this is the part that liberals don't like of what I say, I think that if you lose your asylum case, we have to be a country with a rule of law. I've lived in a country with no laws, Argentina. You don't want that. And we can't allow in everyone from the world. So I believe if you lose your asylum case, if you have been given real due process, I should roll out and deport you if you lose your case. I think what riles so many Americans is we have a court system, and if you lose, you just blend into the word work and you stay here unlawfully. And they don't like that, and I understand that. So I think deport people who lose their cases, not people who have been here 30 years and have 5 children, and you're again going to tear that family apart. So work on what's going on in these countries, be more compassionate, but have an element of the rule of law so people feel like there's a system and it's being abided by everyone.
Sonia, so thank you. I wanted to step in real quick and say we have a slide that shows what the teaching guides and the multiple copies of ENRIQUE'S journey looks like. We also have a slide that talks about that continuing debate over immigration. That's one of our teaching ideas on the Facing History website, as well as the explainer that gets into some pieces of what migration is and just some of the factual details as well. Kelly, did you want to go into next steps, or?
Yeah,
I know that time is ticking away from us.
Yeah, no, I think, Sonia, if you could take one more question.
Yeah, and if I can just say one last thing. The most amazing part of this journey for me is that so many schools have, and facing history schools have used this book as a common read. Junior highs, high schools, universities, 100 universities have selected it in that way. And I love preaching to the converted, but what I most love is that university in Indiana or Alabama that makes all of their students read the book. And what I get are emails every single day that say, they all start the same way. I was forced, usually forced is in capital letters, to read your frigging book. And then they're tone softens and they say, you know, I was raised racist, anti-immigrant. I was taught to hate all immigrants. I don't know an immigrant, but that's what I was taught growing up. You put me in the shoes of a migrant boy, a boy who's willing to go through a hostile world to reach his mother, such a universal story. And it changed my perspective. And I've seen these kids, afterwards they go on spring break and they build homes for single moms in Honduras and schools and water systems. And they launch microloan programs and they hold dance-a-thons to come up with money for prosthetic legs for migrants who lose their arms and legs riding on top of freight trains. These kids do amazing things when they feel empathy for these migrants and they understand them. So I'm hoping to see more of that.
Great, thank you. And I'll end with this final question since we are running out of time, and I'll let you know that there's a lot of really incredibly rich questions in here. So we have those all recorded. I'll share those with you, Sonia, after the fact, and maybe we can see if there's a way to get share some responses. But more of a just general question: is there any update on Enrique and the members of the family? This person says that she uses your website, but last time she checked, we didn't see an update.
I think the update is maybe a year old. So Enrique just had another baby. Enrique, you know, when he crosses into the United States, he starts sniffing glue when he's a young boy to numb the pain of being passed from relative to relative and not having his mother around. And he vows when he crosses the border that he will leave that behind. And as we all know with addiction, which is a disease, although some days I want to throttle him, that it's very hard to stop once you start. We have a whole opioid epidemic in this country. Yeah. And so he's had his ups and downs, to be honest. Sometimes he's great and sometimes he's not. Maria Isabel left him, his girlfriend who he had brought north from Honduras, and now he's with another woman, and he just had a baby with her a few days ago. So, you know, he's functioning. He paints houses in Florida. He lives near his mother. But mostly Maria Isabel, his former wife, and his mother are raising his children.
Great, thank you for that. ERIKA and Sonia, I'll let you guys say some final words, and then I'm going to close out with the last housekeeping items.
So there's a next step slide that just talks about some of our calendar of other upcoming events. We have both in-person and online opportunities for professional development. We invite you guys to log on to check them out. And we even have ways for you to sign up for our current events mailing list, where we often have teaching ideas on relevant issues that are taking place every day. We definitely believe history is taking place every day.
I would just end by saying that we're living through the greatest period of hostility towards migrants since the Great Depression. We're told that all migrants are criminals and rapists. I think this is the time to stand up and educate people about migrants, who they truly are. They're good and bad, mostly good from what I've seen, and why they're coming and what the real solutions are that might slow this flow in some way.
Fantastic. ERIKA and Sonia, I really, really appreciate this conversation. This is a webinar that I want to go back and listen to again. There's just so much rich stuff there, and I really, really appreciated your time tonight. For everybody who joined, we had over 900 registrations for tonight. We had a lot of people on live, over 200 folks here on live online with us tonight. So thank you for being with us live, and for those of you who will be joining us on demand, thank you. Feel free to send those questions in, and we'll see if there's other ways to get some responses out to you. There's also that green box on the left-hand side is your resource list. There are tons of great resources, links. You can get the PowerPoint. You can get a number of articles that Sonia's published, and other great resources on immigration and lesson plans on immigration there, both from us, from Share My Lesson, from Facing History, and from one of the AFT's partners, Kohler in Colorado. Some great content. So without further ado, please do provide feedback in the survey that will pop up when we close out this webinar. And then so long as you've answered at least 2 poll questions, you should be able to download your PDF certificate at this point. If you missed a poll question, you will be able to get back in at a later time to answer whatever question you may have missed. And you'll also get an email from us in about an hour after this concludes with a link back to the platform and access back to that PDF certificate if you need that. So without further ado, I'm going to close this out and say thank you so much for Facing History. Thank you so much, Sonia, for participating tonight, and thank you to all of our educators who joined us this evening for this really incredibly important conversation. Wishing you guys all the best for the remainder of your October as we start going into the rest of our fall school year. Thanks, everyone. Bye.